monsters are a legacy of the ice. The ice retreated up the glen 12,000 years ago. There could be no Loch Ness monsters before the pack ice cleared from Scotland's frozen coastline. The ice burden had depressed the land until melting glaciers raised the sea level, not enough to flood into the rock. There are no marine algae in the lake now. Since then, the land relieved of its burden has risen 16 meters. The rock still owes its fish populations to the sea. Some, like the salmon and eels, still journey up and down the River Ness. Fault line origins and the remorseless ice have wrought a vast chasm, very regular and deep. Rock and clay walls plunge steeply into the abyss, where a flat plain of sediment records 10,000 years of history. The plain is divided by a 50-meter high mound of sand discharged by the River Foynes. Here, near Urquhart Castle, is the deepest point. At 230 meters, enough to submerge the London Telecom Tower. The slopes of Urquhart Bay, scene of underwater avalanches triggered by floods and perhaps earth tremors, since the fault is still active. This is not a rich, productive lake. Sparse mineral nutrients limit the rest of the food chain and the possibility of larger creatures. But Loch Ness is the greatest volume of fresh water in Britain, more water than in the whole of England and Wales put together. Enough to immerse every human being on Earth 3 times over. Room enough, perhaps, for a few mysteries. But if the monster isn't a plesiosaur, then why did anybody think it could be? And if Loch Ness is not a Jurassic Park, then what of the 1,000 items he's actually seen? Follow us now and open the inquiry.
Cool.
Mystery.
Whoa.
The boundary between solid and ethereal, a threshold to imagination, like mist, shadow, and the firelight where our legends are woven. Ever since the prows of the Viking longships bore a sea dragon as a figurehead, Norse and Celtic folklore spoke of the awe of northern waters. In 565 AD, the Christian missionary St. Columba banished a water beast from the River Ness. Pagan echoes of an ill-omened Kelpie or waterhouse were seldom confided to fashionable Victorians touring through the new Caledonian Canal. Nobody told Sir John Murray's bathymetric survey in 1903 as they plumbed an underwater map which even today's technology leaves unchallenged. Yet, by 1868, there was a more solid local tradition of a huge fish in Loch Ness. After one of these encounters in 1916, a local gamekeeper, James Cameron, came into the Drumnadroit Hotel with his face as white as paper. In 1933, Mrs. Mackay, the hotel manageress, was driving to Inverness.
And I yelled at my husband, "Stop! The beast!" It just rose out of the water, black, wet, with the water rolling off it.
Little happened until word reached Alex Campbell, water bailiff and enthusiast of the legend. He gave the story to the Inverness Courier. The word monster appeared. And 1933 was the year of the monster. Local traditions of strange fish were soon brushed aside. On the 4th of August, unprecedented news from a Mr. Spicer. he glimpsed, as it crossed the road, the nearest approach to a dragon or prehistoric animal that I have ever seen in my life. It was the first long neck report, and hence the plesiosaur sensation. Sightings rocketed, and now included long necks. By September, Alex Campbell the bailiff claimed his own plesiosaur sighting. But there was a different sort of monster. A huge multi-humped sea serpent as photographed by Sir Edward Mountain's expedition of 1934. As media attention grew, scientific interest disappeared. Daily Mail-sponsored Marmaduke Wetherill, big game hunter, but also master hoaxer, bravely submitted plaster casts of some strange footprints to the British Museum. He'd used one of his trophies, a hippopotamus foot ashtray. But sightings persisted, and thanks to authors Rupert Gould, Constance White and others, we have 1,000 records.
We saw this great neck.
Something that does a good over down the wind.
Terrific great black thing like the French whale.
And it left a really heavy whip.
This huge black hump.
And then there was the long neck, and you could see the 3 humps.
Surely there was a case to answer. A band of amateurs was roused to investigate. There was the sea serpent and the plesiosaur reported by visitors. But also, beneath any wishful thinking, was that strange fish or upturned boat, the beast reported by local people who knew the loch well. Investigators believe that most reports are sincere, but perception over water can mislead, reflecting our own mental images. An experiment invited people to sketch an object surfacing. Did you see a submarine periscope? A flagpole? Tree branch? Waterbird? Or perhaps a crude model of the head and neck? A third of the observers remembered these things. Actually, it was a simple wooden post, and most people got it right. But then most people don't see Loch Ness monsters. Since 1933, puzzling photographs appeared. And in 1962, organised efforts to solve the mystery began. Some answers began to emerge. Let's join the Loch Ness Investigation Bureau. Autumn, 1933. Hugh Gray takes the first classic photograph. The following year, the Surgeon's treasure, the archetype plesiosaur, Adams later that summer, Latham Stewart, Peter McNair, Cocktail, a cop. After his film in 1960, Tim Dinsdale devoted his life to vindicating the eyewitnesses. In 1962, the Loch Ness Investigation Bureau formed under the energetic leadership of David James. A decade of surface surveillance began. On the high ground at Agnahat, the camera methods dug in for a war of attrition against the law of averages. The youth of the 60s took a stand against establishment science. They kept vigil through the long Highland summer days. In Cologne, Messina, mobile extended the coverage to 70%. 10 summers later, the few snatches of film bore no relation to the classic pictures. On reflection, the classics were too different to fit into a real album. Loch Ness was always fair game for hoaxers. For medium monsters, use features like this fence post. For larger ones, improvise. Try some hay bales just beyond breakers. For really big ones, at a distance, you need a dark room. There, a 20-metre monster with one stroke. Or borrow an image from a postcard, perhaps. 2 for the price of 1. The camera can fool fools all by itself. The photographer saw no monster when she took this picture of the castle in 1982, but it's not a hoax. Would you remember the seagull flying by before the camera froze it into an enigma? But the great 1934 masterpiece was no mistake. The famous plesiosaur head and neck stood guardian over popular expectations for 60 years. It was actually modeled on a toy submarine by Christian Sterling, stepson of the hoax mastermind Marmaduke Weatherall of Hippofoot fame. The supposed photographer, the surgeon Kenneth Wilson, was a stooge. The long years of surveillance also discovered how sincere eyewitnesses could be misled. The water is full of illusion. Wind slicks, rocks, boats, waterbirds, floating logs. Multi-humped sea serpents were boat wakes. Vessels using the canal are out of sight before their wakes come ashore. For many years, since 1931, the Scud too lined the loch, throwing up sinuous serpent-like waves with its icebreaker bows. Even today, boat wakes are the commonest sightings. There were some ideas on the long-necked plesiosaur stereotype as well. Mirage distorts images, and Loch Ness is very prone to them. The lower layer of air makes a kind of distorting prism, especially in calm, Nessie weather. Alex Campbell withdrew his plesiosaur sighting after seeing corners enlarged by mirage of Fort Augustus. Perhaps the heat haze that hot July afternoon of 1933 conjured the writhing shapes seen by the Spices across hot tarmac beyond the brow of the hill. Seals enter the loch and could have done for land sightings. Sometimes genuine long-necked animals are seen. They are swimming deer. Unexpected perhaps, but not that unusual. If the camera watchman proved anything, it showed there was no one cause of monster sightings. The popular stereotypes were nothing to do with the strange fish of local encounters. Also, real aquatic creatures show very little above the surface. Even the best telephoto lenses might start an argument, but could never finish it. The search moved underwater. The vigil broke away from the dark, peat-stained water. To the west, Loch Moura had its own monster tradition, and Clearwater. Reports suggested large creatures moving close inshore, maybe feeding on fish concentrations. Here was a chance to solve the mystery at a stroke. New pioneers surveyed the shallows for unusual bones. The submersible camera hide, Mishan, waited silently 10 meters down, baited to attract fish. The crouched observer looked upward, poised for a huge shadow against the surface brightness. Wide-angle underwater television used the same silhouette principle. Volunteers persisted, but their hopes were tinged with apprehension. New underwater pictures from Loch Ness warned they might look into the face of a nightmare. Here, Robert Rhines had taken up the challenge, despite the dark water, using time-lapse cameras. On the night of the 7th of August, 1972, the camera was flashing into the darkness. At 1:45 a.m., the dozing crews were shaken as a large black trace loomed on an echo sounder pointing at the camera. The photos hinted at shapes within the swirling silt, and computer enhancements were made. Some saw a flipper, but magazine editors did some retouching before everybody else could. Further controversial photos included a body and neck, and that nightmare, the gargoyle head. The dragon was back. The scientists held their nerve and shunned involvement, realizing that the pictures could be debris frozen out of context. Ultimately, this sunken gargoyle tree stump was found nearby, confirming their suspicions. The philosophy changed. Now, the Loch Ness Project's active examination of the whole environment narrowed the possibilities and helped to interpret sightings. Possible habitats were examined through the lenses of underwater cameras and a microscope. Beneath the surface is a complex, dynamic world. The shoreline region is confined by steep slopes to a narrow ribbon of wave-lashed stones with few rooted plants. Any monsters must be predators. The stones shelter invertebrates adapted to the turbulence. Further out, brown trout await the unwary. Deeper down, eels forage after their 3,000-mile journey from the Sargasso Sea. Then, 200 meters of barren wall plunge downward. Clay slopes and precipitous rocky cliffs offer little as a habitat, until we reach the flat silts of the abyssal plain. Here, in contrast to the turbulence above, is a true lost world of stillness, darkness, icy cold, and crushing pressure. But a gentle rain of organic particles nourishes a surprising variety of life in this Ice Age refuge. Most are filter feeders like these worms. Tiny pea mussels and these midge larvae are Ice Age relicts. There are even a few char, themselves exiles from the ice margins. Probably too few for predators. Ascending towards the surface again, we pass through the summer thermocline, an abrupt change to the warmer, lighter water floating above. This open water habitat is where most life is concentrated. Poor nutrients grow few diatoms and other algal plankton. Worse, the dark water blocks the light so vital for photosynthesis. Sparse grazing then for the tiny crustacean animals of the zooplankton. These larger ones feed the fish of the open water. These Arctic char only grow to 30 centimeters on a plankton diet. Many fall prey to the ferox trout, which are the loch's biggest known predators. Any larger residents must also survive on these low fish stocks. Yet some very intriguing sonar records suggested large objects deep in the barren zone between the productive habitats. Why? And animal communities have been revealed, but no lens could show the massive hidden processes within the loch. Ironically, these big pictures were drawn by sound beams. From 1981, the project put the mysterious deepwater sonar contacts into perspective. Day and night, volunteer crews ranged over the depths of the dry mine. Dag walls lowered at the stern broke the water as the wind pivoted the forward superstructure steadily downwind. On this subdued lighting, they mapped fish distribution by ecosystem. Each fish tracing a prism shape as it passes the center of the beam. Most of the energy comes from its buoyancy control, the gas field swim bladder. So this calibration sphere is stronger than the largest sun, or ferox trout about a meter long. Trout are concentrated inshore and apparently of river mouths, but most areas there are actually methane gas bubbles rising from decaying vegetation. They may cause surface disturbance, especially before gases. Out in the open water, the layer of Arctic char stretches throughout the loch, with most shark receiving the evasive zooplankton. It is also hiding the depths by day, only eventually at night to raise the algae. A thinner echo there is the thermocline, that sharp density change between the warm and cold water layers. It is seldom addressed. The prevailing southwesterly winds drive the warm water north, tilting the thermocline. As the wind drops, the water sweeps back and forth. Objects on the surface, such as rocks, are borne along against the wind, looking just like swimming animals. The surge of millions of tons of water creates turbulent tumbles of waves in the thermocline, 40 meters high. Traveling majestically at 1 kilometer per hour, invisible at the surface, they show clearly on echo charts. They reflect and refract horizontal sonar beams in the underwater mirage. They are the largest echoes in the world, and probably caused the gigantic 30-meter Birmingham University sonar contacts. Overwings, the cause of most surface sightings, also appear on the fringes of sonar beams, mimicking exciting objects deep down. In a bid to repeat the mystery contacts, the John Lyne's scanning sonar swept around the vessel. In 1982, there were 1,500 hours of grueling sonar patrol. 20 contacts with exceptional strength and depth were recorded. Some failed to move. Compared to the calibration sphere, these red echoes were stronger than the largest fish. Ruthless checking began. Horizontal sonar beams could be refracted by thermoclines. Rocky cliffs might cause freak echoes. So the equipment was fixed on a mooring, the sonar scanning around it. The strongest contacts ceased. Perhaps some were fixed debris, like discarded trawl gear. So Operation Deep Scan would use many echo sonars to draw a sonar curtain around the wire, a minesweeping exercise. In October 1987, training was over, and the fleet came out to seek decisive action. Vessels in the front line making contacts, dropped markers and radioed in. The follow-up flotilla closed in to plot the positions. Revisiting these positions showed that most contacts were fixed, but 3 had disappeared. Not 10-meter monsters, but stronger than fish echoes and lying far beneath them. No aircraft need dive into this barren zone. Were the contacts really animals, or yet another illusion?
I know, I love it.
How can unusual creatures feed? Where did they come from? And of course, what could they be? If it's too cold for today's reptiles, let alone Jurassic ones, what about other candidates? Amphibians were never seagoing, so couldn't colonize the rock and awake the ice. Mammals, like seals, may cause some sightings, but are soon recognized as they surface to breathe. What about that original strange fish of local tradition? Something must account for those close encounters before the sensation in 1933. But there's a problem. Low productivity limits the whole food pyramid. In theory, the algae support only enough zooplankton to feed about 20 tons of fish, equals just 2 tons of monster population. So the scientists have found no food for large unusual animals. Does this mean that no eyewitness has seen one? One clue is the loch's biggest known fish, the salmon. Spawned in the rivers, its young go to sea weighing a few grams. Returning years later, whole kilos heavier, they owe nothing to the loch's meager food supply. There's a much rarer, larger, and reptilian-looking visitor to British rivers. In 1932, the year before the monster, a Miss MacDonald saw a crocodile-like creature swimming up the River Ness. It had a short neck, but a long snout and most improbably, tusks. Was she mistaken? Or had she seen a sturgeon several meters long on its way to the loch in a vain attempt to find a mate before returning to the sea, leaving no trace save an enigma? Be that as it may, Loch Ness has wider significance. Deep in the stillness of the abyss, fine silts drift gently into an undisturbed time capsule. The Rosetta Project, a quest 200 meters down into the chasm, driving 6-meter cores through the whole span of human civilization into the clays left by the ice. Our history like an open book, and every band a page. A tracery of diatoms spells out changes in the lake water. Pollen dust, the essence of 10,000 summers, tells of changing woodlands, and hence the climate cycles of the past. Even before then, charcoal layers bear witness to forest fires raging through pine trees rich with resin. 3,000 years ago, Bronze Age farms were suddenly abandoned. Perhaps darkening skies and sulphurous rain from Icelandic volcanoes withered the crops. The eruptions leave signatures of microscopic glass shards called tephrates. Floods leave distinctive layers. This clay was laid down by a great flood in 1868, the year of the huge fish report. Industry causes acid rain. Carbon particles peak in the 1970s, but fortunately the loch has resisted acidification. No grounds for complacency. Diatoms warn us of change by sewage and fertilizer pollution. We have left another mark. Radioactive isotopes graph the 1963 peak of atmospheric nuclear testing. And then the long, dark, accusing finger of Chernobyl. Chemical pollution is now falling, partly through environmental awareness. These sediments prove that measures to protect our environment are truly worthwhile. But much remains hidden. As for the mystery that made it so famous, it is still for you to judge whether the waters are a veil which may one day be lifted, or a mirror to our own imagination.